Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Today, what we're doing is looking at a video, we're responding to a video from Rationality Rules Stephen Woodford entitled Theism is Irrational, which was, from what I understand, an opening statement as part of a debate that he partook in. Is that the right term? Perry's actually the grammar Nazi. Is that the right way to say that? Partook?
I mean, I'm not a Nazi, but I think that's acceptable.
Well, so he did this opening statement as part of a debate that he was a part of. And so what we're going to do is respond to it here. And I've got two guests joining me, Dr. Andrew Moon right below me, who is a philosopher, Christian philosopher who's specializing in epistemology. So he's joining me to discuss sort of the first part of this video. And then Dr. Perry Hendricks is joining me to respond to the problem of evil section, which is probably the most lengthy section of the video. I think it starts around the 2-minute mark, 3-minute mark, 2.5 minute mark, and goes all the way up to 7 minutes, I believe. So we're going to address the majority of this video. We'll look at the end briefly at the very end of this. So if you're interested in our thoughts on that, just stick around. We have 8 clips pulled up so far. So we're going to play those clips and then get a response from my two guests. And so is there anything that we'd like to say before we start looking at any of these clips from either of you guys? Let me say to kind of start things off, when I watched this video, I wasn't really sure what I was looking at in terms of the graphics. Okay, I was like, did he have this animated? But then after I watched only about 10 seconds, as someone who has dabbled in AI, like Midjourney and stuff, I noticed that he's actually using artificial intelligence to generate the graphics for this video, which was really, really smart. And it turned out, like, in my opinion, it looked really cool. I actually saw that some people in the comments of his video or some other video, there was a response. I noticed that some people were complaining that the graphics looked really strange and weird, but that's just a result of AI. That's what AI does, is it kind of makes things look strange like that. So anyways, I thought from an aesthetic point, I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was really well done. I even liked the music that he was playing behind it. I thought it was impactful. And then, of course, his British accent did help give his claims a little bit of clout. So that was nice. What do you guys think in terms of the positives of this video before we start to look and start to critique some of the things that he says in this video?
I mean, so he had 2 pretty solid puns. There was one about a burning bush and not beating around it, and then one about Adam's the worm in Adam's apple. I was going to counter with my own joke about like doing this interview over Zoom, but I didn't think it'd be remotely funny. Remotely.
Good one.
Anyway,
yeah, well, we're not on Zoom, so that's one reason why your joke didn't land. The other reason is, well, Andrew, Andrew, let's get to some of your thoughts. What did you think in terms of the positives about this video?
Sorry, I'm still reacting. I actually enjoyed it. Am I coming in okay?
Yeah, you're here.
Okay. Yeah. I thought it was fine as a initial presentation of some of the main issues, and I hope believers in God are challenged by it and think about the issues he brings up. I also enjoy the animations, and I don't know, I was even considering playing it for my philosophy or religion class, just like, hey, how would you respond to this guy? Like, what do you think? And so what I hope we can do today is just dig deeper in some of the issues and learn a little bit more. Maybe some of your viewers will learn more too. So yeah, I overall enjoyed it. Thought it was good.
One of our aims today. Yeah. There's a lot that we all disagree with in this video, but yeah, I thought it was well produced. I thought it was well made, and some of the points that he brings up, like you said, Andrew, are really good to think about and consider as Christians. I think that it's important to really think critically about our beliefs, and that's hopefully what we're going to do today, as well as also being charitable towards Stephen. We don't want to straw man him. We're not trying to play clips out of context or anything. We're going to be playing the majority of the video that we are responding to today, the portions that we are responding to today, we'll be playing most of the video, so you're not going to have to worry about any sort of misleading cuts or anything like that. This is going to be pretty straightforward. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? And this is going to be a pretty chill stream today, so feel free, Andrew and Perry, we talked about going, if there are any like tangents that kind of come up or different philosophical puzzles that come to mind, feel free to expand and go off in different tangents. I'd love to just have a good conversation here with you guys to talk about any sort of issues that are related to the topics that are brought up today. So with that, let's go ahead and pull up the first clip, which is titled this is his first definition of rationality. It's interesting that he gave kind of two definitions of rationality. We'll play both of those. But let's start with the first one that's only about 8 seconds long. So we'll play this clip and then get some commentary from Andrew.
Good. Now let's define rationality. Rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. And
Okay, so that is our first clip. Pretty short, but he basically says that rationality is based on reason or logic. So let's get some of your thoughts, Andrew. Go ahead and start us off on this one.
Yeah, so Cameron, as you mentioned, he gives two definitions, and they're actually not the same. And, this is kind of I feels like a more of a popular level video. And so I'm going to be kind of criticizing it as if it were, something more scholarly. But the point isn't just to point out a wrong thing, but more just maybe we can learn something from it. So the concern about this definition, I wrote some things on my board here. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, let me go ahead and put it up.
So rationality, the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. So I thought this would be a good opportunity for people to learn just about what logic and reason are. And that'll help you see why this can't be a very good definition of rationality. The next definition will be better. So logicians typically care about truth-preserving inferences. So here's one. So I say, all right, okay, all dogs are friendly. Fido is a dog. Therefore, Fido is friendly. So this is truth-preserving in this sense. Like, if the premises are true, if it's true that all dogs are friendly and Fido is a dog, then it's got to be true that Fido is friendly. And that's a matter of logic. Logic is also concerned about truth-preserving inferences by virtue of form. So like this argument here, it could be put in the form all A's are B's, X is an A, X is a B. That's kind of a simple way. There's a better way to do this with predicate logic. But so logic will tell you if these sentences are true, then this other sentence will be true. Okay. The problem with logic, though, is it won't tell you whether your initial premises are true. It won't tell you whether all dogs are friendly or whether Fido is a dog. So that's going to be a limit of defining rationality or rational belief, which I think is what he's aimed after, solely in terms of logic. And that's going to be also the same if you're going to, as defining rationality in terms of reason. I mean, by reason alone, you can't know that all dogs are friendly. By reason alone, you can't know that Fido is a dog. So one of the questions for any theory of rational belief, sorry, am I coming through still?
Yeah, you're coming through. There's just a little bit of a delay, and there seems to be some intermittent internet issues, but we can hear you fine. So just continue to go,
okay.
Even if it looks like it's a little bit choppy. Just keep on going unless I stop you.
Yeah, so logic will maybe get you from one premise to another premise, but it's not going to tell you whether it's rational to believe the initial premise or even whether the initial premise is true, with some maybe minor exceptions. That's going to be a problem for the later discussion because, a lot of theists take belief in God or the proposition that God exists as one of their starting points, right? As one of the starting premises. Alvin Planning, others, myself, I mean, we think that the proposition that God exists can be one of your starting premises. Also called, for some of us, it could be properly basic, right? That's kind of a term people use. That's hinting to the future, but But for now, I can just mention that's why you wouldn't want to define rationality solely in terms of just reason or logic. Yeah, does that make sense, Cameron? Any question of clarification or?
Well, what I was going to say is that he may be using logic in a different sense. So I think that it's almost like I think it would be like a synonym of reason. From like, if you just have a normal conversation with someone who's not really well versed in philosophy or anything or apologetics, they might use logic in a different way than we might use it as people who are more familiar with the way that it's used in academia. So we might use logic in the sense of like you're using it, where it's truth preserving and you're looking at like a deductive argument, or you might be looking at different rules of inference. And so logic has, I think, it's used differently in the academic world than it is in the popular, everyday people world. And I think in that world, it means something like something that's reasonable or something that's based on reason, so it'd be almost like a synonym of reason. That would be the only pushback I could think of, is that he may be just defining or using the term logic in a different way.
Yeah, I'm glad you're defending Stephen here. I'm open to that being true, but I think even when we use the word logic in its more informal sense, if you ask someone, can you know by logic alone whether all dogs are friendly? I don't know if people would say yes to that, whether logic alone, in your normal, ordinary sense of the word logic, whether logic alone can tell you whether all dogs are friendly. I mean, most of people would say, no, you have to go check. You have to go see if all the dogs are friendly. So even in the colloquial sense, I think that the word logic is going to be actually a little more like the philosopher's definition. Same for reason. By using sheer reason alone, can you know that all dogs are friendly? I think that's not. But I don't hold a firm view on this. This is how things seem to me.
So one other point is that he did say that rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. So he's using not a conjunction. I can't remember what is the logical term for disjunction. Okay, yeah. So he's using a disjunction there. So it could be that if the logic doesn't apply, then it could just be that being rational just means that you're being in accordance with reason. Because we've got the disjunction there. It's as long as one of the disjuncts is confirmed, then at least the definition still goes through. My problem is that defining rationality in terms of being in accordance with reason seems relatively, if not explicitly, circular. It seems like you're using a term to explain what the thing is. That's why I like the second definition a little bit better, because he doesn't really define it necessarily in terms of reason. I think that one still goes in there, but the one that I focus on in the later definition is evidence. But it just seemed to me like it wasn't that great of a definition. If you're using reason as part of what it means to be rational, that doesn't really illuminate what's going on. Like, what does it actually mean to be rational? And to be fair, he does go on to then give an example of what he means, and then he sort of refines the definition a little bit later. So that's what we'll get to in just a moment. But but Cameron, to push back, I think the same thing I said about logic can apply to reason. Like, close your eyes. Can you, by reason alone, know that all dogs are friendly? And I don't think you can know that by reason alone. So I don't. I'm not know that it's false.
Sorry.
Yeah, you can't know that it's true. You can't know that it's false either.
That's right. You can't know either way by reason alone. And I do intend to be using reason in the colloquial sense.
The colloquial, yeah.
But I do think you're right, Cameron, that if we don't mean reason in the way I'm using it, then it does seem very circular, as you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good start. Should we move on and play the next clip? So what I'd like to do for this one, I know that you wanted me to start this one a little bit later, but I'd like to actually start it where we started the previous one, so we'll get both definitions and his example, and that way we can get more of the context. So let me just go ahead and play the clip, and then we'll get going.
Now let's define rationality. Rationality is the quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. And I think it's best conveyed through an example. Hundreds of years ago, it was rational to believe that diseases such as cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death were caused by miasma. bad air. After all, wherever there was foul odours, such as by sewers and crowded urban slums, there were diseases. Belief in miasma was based on the best evidence of the day. It was a rational belief. Today, however, we know that these diseases are not caused by bad air. We in fact have so much evidence to the contrary that we now consider it irrational to believe the miasma theory of disease. A belief is
Oh, whoops, I stopped it a little bit early. Let me go ahead and continue.
rational, then, if and only if that belief is in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the believer.
Again, I stopped that a little bit early, but you can see it on the screen there. A belief is rational if it's in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the believer. Now, one question I would have, and this would have to just be directed at Stephen, and if he's here, then he can just leave it in the comments and let us know. But I wonder if he was thinking that evidence was a synonym for logic, if he was using those two interchangeably, which I think would have another set of problems if that's what he was doing. But that's kind of what it seems like he's doing here. Or maybe it was, I don't know. That's why I wanted to just ask him directly if he is watching this. But yeah, Andrew, go ahead and explain what you think about this clip here.
So I think this definition of rationality is much better. I have it on my board, but I guess it's right there in the caption. So there's two things I like better about this definition. First, it makes clear that rationality is person relative. So most philosophers will agree that truth is not relative. Normally what you hear from truth is relative, man. Well, that's not correct, but what's more likely correct is that rationality is relative. So it's rational for one person to believe is different from what's rational for another person to believe. And I thought his disease example is really clear about that. Given that the evidence that they had back then, what was rational for them to believe was different from what's rational for us to believe. Now, the funny result about that is whether it's rational to believe in theism is also going to then be dependent on a person's evidence. So that's just good to keep in mind. When you see a video that says, theism is irrational or theism is rational, you got to be careful. It might be that, depending on the person's evidence, theistic belief might be rational for some, but it won't be rational for other people. Mm-hmm. So that's just the first point. The second point is this definition he gives, if you just take out the reason part, so a rational belief or a belief is rational if and only if it's in accordance with the reason and evidence available to the believer. If you take out the reason part, then it's just a definition of what's called evidentialism. And that's a very well-respectable view in epistemology now. And it's then defended mostly by Richard Feldman and Earl Coney at University of Rochester. By my friend Kevin McCain, he defends evidentialism. So I guess I would say, yeah, it's a decent definition. I mean, I'm not an evidentialist. I think there's some counterexamples to it, but I would say it's very respectable. It's very good. Whereas the first definition, I almost no philosopher would probably agree with.
Do you have any other thoughts on evidentialism? Would you like to give some reasons to think, maybe cite some of the counterexamples that you know of against evidentialism?
Yeah, sometimes it's not really clear what to say that evidence is. So, suppose you have a thought right now, and then you try to think what's your evidence that I am having a it's kind of unclear what the evidence is. It's more something you just know directly that you have a thought right now. Some things you might just know directly when there's no intermediary evidence available. Actually, maybe now's a good time. It might help to actually talk a bit about what things might count as evidence. So
sure, yeah, that was going to come up later, but we can talk about it now.
Yeah, I think talking about it now might help later when we get to the relevant section. So, of course, epistemologists disagree about, like, there are many different views about what gets to count as evidence. And so this is just one picture that I find plausible. It's the picture you get from Alvin Plantinga in his book Warrant and Proper Function. Okay, so he divides evidence into 3 types. Okay, so I'm going to use my board again. So there's what he calls propositional evidence. And, like I gave in the example earlier, all dogs are friendly, Fido is a dog, therefore Fido is friendly. That would be propositional evidence where you're believing a conclusion based on premises, where those premises are propositions. So whenever you're believing the conclusion on the basis of any sort of logical support, on the basis of other premises or propositions, that's called propositional evidence. And it's the sort that you see most focused on in philosophy discussions because we care about arguments. A second type of evidence is, he calls it sensuous evidence. Nobody really calls it that now. I'd call it sensory evidence. So this is just evidence you get from your senses. Like if it looks to you like an object is red or round. That's sensory evidence. If I touch the screen and it feels a certain way, then let's say it feels hard, then I'll have evidence that the screen is hard. Smell, taste, touch. So that's going to be your sensory evidence. And the last type of evidence is, he calls it impulsional evidence. This was back in 1993. Nobody really calls it that anymore. Now they're just called something like intellectual seemings, or maybe even just seemings. And this is just this sort of evidence is what seems true to you. So it might seem to you that nothing can be black and white all over at the same time. Or it might seem to you that nothing could be a square circle, or that 1 + 1 = 2, or all bachelors are unmarried. So these are intellectual seemings. Many people have heard about trolley cases where you're asked, does it seem wrong to kill one person to save 5 people? And a lot of them will say, yes, that is wrong, at least in some cases. And that's a seeming. That's these are also called intuitions. So yeah, these would be 3 types of evidence. And just pointing out, the propositional one is the logic one, the one focused on logic. And earlier I asked the question, well, what's going to be your evidence for the premises of these arguments? And that's where normally sensory or intellectual seemings will come in. Those will be what support your belief in the premises. Okay.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Any thoughts about that, or?
No, I think that was pretty straightforward. But this is going to be relevant a little bit later on. One thing that I did want to point out is that part of the definition, let me go ahead and pull it back up on the screen here, is that he says it's got to be within the reason and evidence available to the believer. I wanted to kind of highlight the word available. So there's a few different senses of what it could mean to be available to someone, especially when we're talking about evidence. So let me just give a different example. So there's a couple things that are available to me immediately, not in terms of evidence, but just something that's available, like my pen or my phone, my mouse. There's different things that are available immediately to me right here in front of me. There's other things that are available should I decide to get up and move around or even travel. So I could travel to, I've got family that lives in Austin. I could travel to Austin and then get something from them. That would be quote unquote available, but it's not immediately available to me. So we've got to sort of define what we mean by available. There's another, to make it even more extreme, it's in one sense, it could be that $1 million is available to me. I don't have $1 million right now, but in the future, I could make enough money so that it would be available to me in the future. And so there's a bunch of different senses that we could mean when we say available. And the reason why that's important is because when we're thinking about what is available in terms of evidence to someone, we've got to ask the question, does that mean immediately available, like they already have that evidence? Or does it mean that that's available in the sense of like it's somewhere else, but they could access it in some way? And then the question is, how accessible is it? Is there some sort of barrier between them and accessing it. So like in terms of evidence, it could be that someone doesn't have the intellectual capacity to be able to assess that type of evidence, or they may not have the relevant books, or the relevant access to the internet. They may not. There may be barriers to their ability to access that evidence, and so that would be one of the biggest questions that I'd have with this definition. I'd have to really know what we mean by available, and I don't want that to sound too pedantic. I think it's actually really important when we want to say that theism is irrational, or that theism is irrational for this individual. I think that that's going to be actually really important, even on if we accept this definition.
Yeah, can I jump in on that, Cameron?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you put your finger on one of the key debates that was the focus of epistemologists in the 90s and probably the early 2000s, maybe a little of the 80s. I mean, what you're really putting your finger on is the internalism, externalism debate. So internalists will say whatever that evidence is has to be within your mind and immediately available, in the sense that, like, typically they'll say on the basis of reflection alone, you could just introspect and see, yeah, that's the evidence. Things that are outside of your mind, that are not internal to your mind, that is external to your mind, so those can't be counted as part of your evidence. So internalism is going to, that says, yeah, only the things that are in your mind, internally available, are relevant to what you're rational in believing. And externalists will say, no, things beyond that could also be relevant to what you're rational in believing. It's interesting that when Plantinga talks about what sorts of things count as evidence, he kind of follows the internalist here. Like, if you look at my little list, these propositions will be typically premises that you believe in an argument, or your sensory experiences, or your seemings. Those are all within your mind, and so they are available to your mind. Something like, let's say I have a theory that I really like, and then somebody sent me an email that has a devastating counterexample, but I haven't seen the email yet. I mean, if I haven't seen the email yet, then I can still be rational in believing my theory. It'll only be when I read the email and get that evidence, it becomes internal to my mind. It's only then that I can stop being, I would stop being rational in believing.
Yeah.
That's going to be the internalist.
That's the question that I'd have with respect to this definition of rationality. Is I think it depends on how accessible, or are you in already possession of this evidence? And it seems like Stephen wants to say that you don't have to be in possession of it to be irrational. If you're not in possession, like just the fact that that evidence exists somewhere, even if it's not directly or immediately accessible to you, that still makes you irrational, because it exists, but you're not you don't have immediate grasp of it, but it nevertheless exists, and so that's what sort of makes you. That was the sense that I got when he said that belief in miasma is now irrational because that evidence exists. Even if someone held that belief and didn't have the counter evidence, they would still be irrational for them. And I think that's this. Like, I'm trying to be, again, as charitable as possible here. I think that's what he's saying. So it could be that I'm mistaken. I could just be wrong, that that's not what he believes. But I think that's what's going on, given what he says about the problem of evil. Like, some Christians haven't thought too deeply about the problem of evil, or the problem of religious disagreement, or the argument from divine hiddenness. A lot of Christians haven't really critically thought about their beliefs or objections to their beliefs, or they haven't considered, for example, Michael Tooley's argument from evil, like his very specific formulation of the problem of evil. They haven't considered that, or Paul Draper's argument from evil. There's a lot of literature out there that Christians are just completely unaware of. So, yeah, I think that this is a problem. I think that we have to define it in terms of what is actually accessible. And I think the example that you just gave, Andrew, is a really good one. Like, if you've got this counterexample that only exists in the form of an email that you haven't read yet, does that make you irrational just because the email was sent to you? Or does it matter? Do you have to actually read it? And then if you go on believing it despite, not being able to respond to that counterexample, does that then make you irrational? I think my intuition is that that's when irrationality happens, is when you've been presented with this data and then you nevertheless go on believing it despite, having been refuted or objected to or defeated.
Yeah, so I lean internalist in this area. So here's some trouble for if you take the view that the evidence just has to exist. Like think of the example Stephen gave with miasma. I'll use a different example. Let's say a flat Earth belief. So I think people thousands of years ago, maybe certain people didn't have access to the astronomical evidence. I think they were rational in believing the Earth was flat. Now, was there evidence that the Earth was round? I mean, the evidence existed, like in some form. I mean, like it was still there. Like if you were able to get outside of the atmosphere, you could see that the Earth is round. So that's what pushes me to think, well, yeah, it's got to be something internally available. So I'm kind of agreeing with you. But if you get that result, then
you can't just say that theism is irrational. It's got to be person relative. You've got to look at each individual case, find out what this person is aware of, what they've been exposed to, whether or not they've developed defeaters to those potential defeaters that they've been given. I'm using a lot of language here, but you kind of get the idea, right? Is that it's really person relative, kind of like what you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, and this can help us be a lot kinder to other people too, rather than, thinking, oh, they are irrational. I mean, we don't know what they've been exposed to. Like if somebody's grown up in a community where all the smartest people they know believe in God, they had not met an atheist yet. Let's say their parents like made it so that they were unable to read atheist literature, so they didn't even know it was out there. I mean, it's hard to say that that person wouldn't be rational in believing in God. And I think we should say the flip side, and this is for any Christians watching, like some Christians are a little bit harsh on atheists, but if you're an atheist growing up in let's say, secular Europe, and you've just never met anybody who's ever believed in God, and the only religious people you've ever met are like really weird and just
fundamentalist.
Yeah. And you see pictures on TV and they're like dancing in weird ways, at least weird to you. I mean, I think for such people, I think those people would be entirely rational in being atheist, given their background evidence and what they know. So I think this applies beyond race and beyond religion to issues about race and gender and other ways in which we tend to be harsh on each other. Oftentimes the other person is more rational than you think, but they just have different sets of evidence.
So Perry, we've been talking for a while. You haven't really said anything, and I know that your section is coming up soon, but do you have any thoughts so far, on stuff that we've talked about?
I basically agree with Andrew. I thought I was just here to be the eye candy, but I wasn't really doing that well either.
All right. Well, why don't we continue with the clips here? So this one is our third clip, and this one, the title that I gave to it is "Reason for Irrational Beliefs." And I think what he does in this section, and again, this is just what I interpret him doing, is it seems like he's giving a sort of psychological explanation for why people maintain irrational beliefs, which is a different question. Psychology is not epistemology. There's a difference between those. But let's listen to this clip and then get Andrew to comment.
And of the beliefs we hold that are not rational, we typically maintain them because we haven't considered, much less even recognized, the absence of their evidential and logical support. Instead, we've leaned on intuition, authoritative figures, and cognitive bias. That said, there is a pretty...
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. So the word intuition here, what you said earlier, Cameron, about the word logic or reason, I do think about the word intuition, the way philosophers use it might be a little different. Um, if we mean by intuition just kind of how things seem to you, and we made it even like, I mean, we need that as a basis for knowing things like, no bachelor can be married, or nobody can be taller than themselves. I mean, we need these intuitions to know even basic things like that. Um, and we'll probably get to this later, but I think Stephen will need the intuition that God would never allow gratuitous evil, or that even that some instance of evil is gratuitous. I mean, we kind of have these, yeah, that seems right. It just seems right. And at some point, we're going to have to get to a stopping point to the premises of our arguments, and they're going to be supported by intuition. So maybe the charitable interpretation is he might mean intuition in a very specific way, and then, yeah, that's bad. If we mean like, by intuition, I just know that my team's going to win, or something like that, my sports team. But if we mean something a little broader in the way I've talked about, then it seems like you need intuition. You need to count intuition as evidence. I have a thought on authoritative figures, but any thought on that, on the intuition part?
I basically agree, and I think that Perry would agree as well. Is that, I mean, later on he does use intuition to see. I mean, does he explicitly say that, Perry?
That no, he does not explicitly say that he uses intuition.
Okay, but it seems, at least it seems that way. But we'll play those clips, and you guys can judge for yourselves. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's important to point out, is that especially when it comes to like, if you're doing philosophy of religion, especially if you're like really looking deep into a specific argument, then what you're going to find, at least what I found, is that once you get to the edges of the dialectic, which means once you've looked at like the responses to the responses to the responses to the responses, and you're like, you reach the end and there's no more responses to read. Usually when you get to that point, to that level, it almost comes down to a clash of intuitions on some very esoteric, like very minute, specific thing. And so in a lot of cases, like, and that's not just true of theists, like theists who want to defend an argument. It's also true of atheists who want to reject some argument. They're going to have to, well, in the case of like Alex O'Connor, he has toyed with the idea, at least, of mereological nihilism. And that's a belief, or at least a view about the world, which, I mean, if you think about it, when you get down to it, is going to be based on intuition, at least at some level. So, yeah, I think that it's basically impossible to get away from, and we rely on these intuitions when it comes to logic, when it comes to the rules of inference, modus ponens, modus tollens, all these different rules of inference. And so it's not a bad thing, and that's not to say that it's infallible. I think that's a sort of misunderstanding that people have about intuition, is that just because you want to say some positive things about it doesn't mean that you can't say any negative things about it. You can also be a sort of fallibilist about intuition and say that sometimes it gets it right. Most of the time, I suppose, it gets it right. And then there are points where you can get it wrong. And so that's why it's important to really think clearly as you can, about these difficult cases when it comes to these big metaphysical questions, like, does God exist? What are the fundamental truths? And that's what we attempt to do on Capturing Christianity, is really think hard and deep and critical about these things at a very deep level. And so we don't just take it at face value. We try to look as deep as possible and do what we can, in the sense of what we're capable of as humans. But yeah, any other thoughts, Andrew?
Yeah, well, and just to emphasize, not only are intuitions or seemings fallible, as in sometimes they go wrong, but our sensory experiences are fallible too. Like, our very perception is fallible. So sometimes we know
that hallucinations.
I might think that I saw Fred when I was really Harry. Right. There's hallucinations, or I might just misread a sign. So, I mean, I can already see someone typing in the YouTube comments like, well, I have an intuition, and, like, give an instance where intuition leads you astray. I mean, yeah, for any source of evidence, it could lead you astray, or pretty much any source. But that's not enough to show it's unreliable generally.
Yeah, exactly.
Should I go on to the authoritative figures point.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and maybe it'd be helpful to kind of back out and get an. So I sort of, when I laid out this clip, or when I started to explain like what's the point that he's trying to make here, it seems like he's trying to explain psychologically why people maintain irrational beliefs, and then he lists a couple things like they rely too much on intuition, authoritative figures, and cognitive bias, and then he also later on mentions faith. We'll get to that clip in just a little bit, but it seems to me like those are more psychological factors that he's citing here as a way of explaining why people maintain irrational beliefs, but that's completely distinct from establishing that some belief is in fact irrational, right? That's I guess the point that I wanted to make, is that even if you establish, we could even assume that intuition is bad or whatever, that relying on testimony from authorities is bad, and that cognitive biases are bad, which I agree that cognitive biases are bad. But it doesn't follow that when you look at some person, their belief is irrational, right? And so this is a distinct question, like the psychological factors that are at play that might psychologically explain why someone has an irrational belief, or say some belief, that does not entail that their belief is irrational.
So you are entering into thick waters again. There's a hard question about how psychology should get incorporated into epistemology, and okay, there's a lot of thoughts right now. So there's something called debunking arguments, and debunking arguments do attempt to show a belief is irrational by giving a psychological explanation for that belief. A classic example is, Freud saying that, oh, you only believe in God because of wishful thinking. Like that might be an attempted debunking argument. Well, I guess that was just a claim. It wasn't much of an argument. But typically for these arguments to work, you need an additional premise. So premise one would be like, belief B was formed in way W. Mm-hmm. And then premise two, way W is unreliable or is not aimed at truth or something like that. And then you might need another premise. You could do this all in one premise. If a belief is formed in way W and is unreliable, then it's not rational. You could run the argument that way, and therefore the belief is not rational. So typically you'll need an empirical or psychological premise, and then you'll need a linking premise that connects the psychological claim to the epistemological claim. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is you might think that merely giving the explanation of explaining to someone and maybe successfully explaining to someone how their belief was formed in an unreliable way, that might not alone do it. What you might need is for them to grasp, like once they realize that their own belief was formed in an unreliable way. This goes back to the internalist point. Once someone realizes that their belief was formed unreliably, then they have an irrational belief. So, okay, just two terms here, and externalists, the people who think that rational belief can depend on factors outside of your mind. Externalists will typically think that if your belief, as a matter of fact, was formed in an unreliable way, let's say through a cognitive bias or something, that's enough to make the belief irrational. Internalists will think even if that's not enough, it has to be that the believer is apprised of that fact, so the believer kind of learns that their belief was formed unreliably, and then that would be enough to make their belief irrational. So just a quick example, if let's say I believe I'm seeing a snake, and then somebody tells me that they put some wild drug into my drink that makes people hallucinate snakes. Okay, now that's an empirical psychological claim that they gave me a drug and this drug makes people hallucinate. That's an empirical psychological claim. But once I learn of that, now my belief that there's a snake will no longer be a rational belief. That's just my concrete example. And you could try to do that with theistic beliefs too, in the same way.
what I was trying to summarize what you were saying here, and it sounds to me that there's maybe three different propositions that would have to be maintained in order for this to really go through. So one of them would be that this say intuition. Let me go ahead and put the slide back up here so you can see the three different ingredients that he says usually are accompanied by an irrational belief, or an irrational belief usually is brought about by, say, intuition or authoritative figures or cognitive bias. So there's the first part is that you've got to establish or argue that each of these is bad. Okay, you've got to establish that they're unreliable, right? If some belief is based solely on intuition, then that's unreliable, and so, but that's just one part of the equation, right? That's one part. The other part is you've got to establish that the person, the individual, they form their belief in that manner. They form their belief on the basis of intuition. So you've got to establish that. That's the sort of second component. And then the third component, I think, would be the sort of linking or conditional premise. If someone developed their belief on the basis of, say, intuition, then they would not be rational. And so that would be, I think, the sort of three components that would have to be argued in order to establish that some belief is irrational. Is that sort of what you're arguing? Or,
that would be
what
the
you've
main
just explained?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, that's right. And so
yeah, and to me it seems
that's the psychology to the epistemology.
Yeah, and that seems pretty difficult, actually. It seems pretty difficult to establish that someone is believing on this or that basis, and then you've also got to argue that believing on that basis is bad or unreliable. And we've already talked about intuition. So maybe this is a good point for us to go back and look at these three components that he outlines as sort of bad reasons to believe something, or irrational ways of coming to a belief. So the first one is intuition. We've talked about that we agree that intuition is fallible, but that doesn't mean that it's unreliable. The second one is authoritative figures. So let's look at that one a little bit closer.
Yeah. Authoritative figures, it's actually pretty straightforward. I mean, we need authoritative figures to form rational beliefs about all sorts of issues. You know, if I go to my doctor and, they look at certain symptoms of mine and they say that I have a certain condition, I mean, I'll typically be rational in believing what the doctor said. Or another one, let's say I go to Cameron and I ask him about a certain camera that I should buy and whether it's a good camera. Like, I would just take Cameron's word for it because I know he's an authority, somewhat of authority on issues related to photography and taking pictures. We don't want to get rid of authorities across the board. We can't do all of our thinking ourselves. We need help. That's why I think the total of thinking is going to be a division of labor, where we learn from other people and their expertises. And, I have a hard time believing that Stephen would really deny this. So he's probably thinking, there's going to be some reliable authoritative figures and there's going to be some unreliable authoritative figures. And he's probably thinking about unreliable authoritative figures, maybe some sort of like cult leader or, people like that. And of course we don't want to believe on the basis of what, some cult leader says. And exactly what we said before, what is going to apply here. We're going to want reasons to think that these authoritative figures are reliable or unreliable. If they're unreliable, then Cameron, like you said, did I indeed believe on the basis of this authoritative figure? And if so, then does that make the belief irrational? And that's what you would need, I think, for, I guess, a debunking argument. So.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really fair, and I like how you made the distinction between reliable authority figure and an unreliable authority figure. I think that's a good distinction. For science alone, like if you just think about the whole field of science, like unless you're a scientist, and even scientists work in very specific fields. So a scientist that works in one field is going to have to rely on the authority of some other scientist who's working in a different field when it comes to beliefs or thoughts about other aspects of science. So like a biologist is going to have to rely on a cosmologist in order to develop really good beliefs about cosmology. And so it's not that, you can't just like say authoritative figures and then act like that settles anything, right? We all have to rely on authoritative figures. One of the things that I try to do on my channel, Capturing Christianity, is point out that there are experts in this field. So like when you're thinking about questions, does God exist? Is Christianity true? There are experts that write and study this subject, and they usually fall in the category of philosophy of religion. They usually have like other interests, so they'll be experts in epistemology like Andrew. But philosophy of religion is the area of expertise people specialize in. And I want to point to the fact that there are experts in this area. So like some people, I think that when it comes to like these religious questions, they just think, well, there's no experts on when it comes to religious questions. It's all just like we just internalize and think about like what's true or what's not true. And so everyone is sort of their own expert when it comes to religious beliefs. But people don't really treat it that way when it comes to other beliefs, like beliefs about your health, beliefs about the natural world, like scientific beliefs. You know, we have experts in all of these fields, but when it comes to religious beliefs, that somehow like just disappears, like the need for experts. But experts in that field do exist. They're called philosophers of religion. And B, we need to be informed and read what they have to say and listen to what they have to say. That's part of the reason why I invite so many of these experts on my channel and try to expose them to my audience, is because there are experts in this field that have really good and interesting things to say. So, and we should, I think, be able to rely on them in the same way that we can rely on other authority figures like doctors and scientists. So, and it's not to say that, you know, it's good to get, when it comes to health issues, I mean, something that I've learned personally is that it's good to get multiple opinions when it comes to health issues. So don't just like go to one doctor and think that you've got the best diagnosis. Like look around, do your own research and talk to other authorities and then do some critical thinking and try to come to a conclusion. And that's what I think you should do when it comes to religion as well, is don't just read one person, read a bunch of different people, read people that disagree with you. And so, yeah, I've been going for a while, but Andrew, feel free to come back in, or Perry, if you have thoughts.
I feel free to, but I'm not going to.
Okay.
I will say, and we can't get into this, and I don't even think I'd be prepared to talk about it. Sometimes it is hard to determine who is an expert in a field, and sometimes you have to become somewhat knowledgeable about a field in order to know who the experts are, and that makes it difficult. And even like you mentioned, Cameron, we look to scientists for some information, but then we might have to focus on like which science is it, the cosmologist or the biologist that's going to matter on a certain issue. And so it's difficult, but that doesn't mean there is no such thing as expertise and that we can't learn from experts and sometimes rely on them.
Yeah. I was also going to mention, and maybe this is not even worth bringing up, but I'll bring it up anyways because I said we were going to try to have a conversation. Like some people point to the fact that most philosophers are atheists as a way of saying that like, belief in God is not rational, or it has some sort of defect, right? Because most philosophers are atheists. But I want to say that if you actually look at the studies, the philosophers of religion, the majority of those who specialize in the arguments for and against the existence of God, I think it's something like 77%, or it's in the 70s, that most people believe in God that are experts in philosophy of religion. So like, that's important, but then it's also important to realize that just being a philosopher doesn't mean that you have expertise in every area of philosophy. It's the same way that like someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is an expert in his one field, but then he'll go and pontificate online about all of these different vast subjects as if he's some sort of authority figure, when he's not, in fact, an authority figure on critical thinking or on logic or on reason or on any of these other areas that are really strictly philosophical, that he has no training or expertise in. And so I think that the same applies to philosophers. So like you could point to a philosopher, say in ethics, who that's what they study. They've done all of the research on that particular area. But just because they're an expert in ethics doesn't mean that they're an expert in religion or in philosophy of religion or in the arguments. And so I think that's important to just point out and highlight. And maybe that's responding to something that no one was thinking about, but I did want to bring that up. And feel free to share thoughts, or we can move on.
Yeah, I think that is also very important. And I think also just as a philosopher, I mean, we would be good at philosophical aspects of, philosophy of religion. Um, but there's going to be other aspects of religion that, we might not be that great on. I mean, as someone who's already a Christian, I might think that someone who has who prays, has a rigorous, devotional life, they might be a better expert on some aspects of the spiritual life than a philosopher. Um, but they wouldn't be an expert on the philosophical side of the issues. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, yeah, let's get to the last one that he mentions, cognitive bias, and then we'll turn to faith. I feel like we're kind of dragging this out, but we'll go a little bit quicker here. So cognitive bias, let's discuss that one briefly, and then we'll move on to the next clip.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think we should be quick, and we should have a lot of time for the problem of evil. So I would just say cognitive bias. I mean, bias is kind of a negative term, but if he kind of means that there's structures in our minds that lean us toward God, toward belief in God, we could just say the same things apply that we said about the other two topics. I mean, we want to know if these biases are indeed unreliable or would lead us to false beliefs or not. And then if so, we can develop a debunking argument. If not, then we can't. There's a lot of tricky waters here, but I think they would be too long to get into. So I'll probably just leave it at that about cognitive bias.
And one other thought I would have is that it's probably the case that we're suffering from biases that we're unaware of. And that doesn't just apply to theists. It applies to everyone who's thinking about these issues. I think we all deal with bias. And that's one of the reasons why when someone points out that someone is biased, I'm like, okay, but you're biased too. Like everyone has their own biases in their own ways. So it's almost irrelevant to point out that someone is biased. What we try to do is eliminate the bias as much as possible through critical thinking. And as long as I think that you're putting effort into that, that's the best that we can do. Doesn't mean that we're going to eliminate bias, but it just means that we're at least aware of it and trying to mitigate it as much as possible. So that's all I'll say. Let's go ahead and move on to the next clip, which is starting at 2:05, I believe, right about here. And this one has to do with faith. So he gives a definition of faith. We're actually still in the very beginning part of this video. And we're already an hour in, but this is just where he's setting things up and giving definitions. And it's really important actually to focus on the definitions, because if the definitions are problematic, then what that's going to mean is that the conclusion that he wants to arrive at, that theism is irrational, it may not follow if we find problems earlier on in the way that the whole thing is set up. So that's why it's important to focus on these things. So let's now play the clip, and then we'll get some thoughts on faith.
Bias. That said, there is a pretty famous other way of maintaining irrational beliefs that some even venerate, namely faith. Per Hebrews 11, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. To have faith is to believe in a proposition despite there not being sufficient evidence for doing so. So there's our keywords front and center. Now,
all right. Yeah, and again, he's saying that there's all the keywords, there's the definitions of words and everything, and now we're about to jump into the juicy parts. So the juicy parts are coming. Just stick around. We're going to talk about this definition of faith, which it's like, it didn't really make sense to me for why he brought up faith in the first place and gave it this definition that he did, because he doesn't really, it's not like central to the rest of the video. Like he doesn't even bring it up in the rest of the video. So it was strange to me that he even defined faith at all in the video.
One strange thing is he takes the Hebrews verse, substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen, and then he gives a definition that doesn't at all match what the verse is saying. It was kind of odd. I mean, I'm not sure actually what to think of that verse, but his definition, to have faith is to believe in a proposition despite there not being sufficient evidence for doing so. The word sufficient is a little unclear. I think he means despite there not being sufficient evidence for rational belief, I guess. And so a quick thing, I mean, almost everybody working on faith now thinks that there can be such a thing as rational faith. That does include rational belief. You can have there could be a lot of evidence pointing to your sports team winning, and you can have faith that your team will win, or you might have faith in your child or your friend to pull through, and you might have a lot of evidence that they'll pull through. So, there's really nothing in conflict about rational belief and faith, as far as I can tell. I guess I'll keep it short and leave it at that. There's nothing about faith that means or implies, therefore you don't have good evidence for it.
Yeah, I could also just point people to the videos that we've done with Dr. Liz Jackson. We've done multiple videos on definitions of faith and all that. So the one that he gives here is not one that's going to be defended by anyone. So I think that's important to point out. We're trying to be as charitable as we are to Stephen. I think that Stephen should also try to be as charitable as he can toward theists, and he should probably use definitions that theists are arguing for, or different analyses that are being raised in the literature. Those are the ones that he, I think, should focus on. So, but again, it didn't even seem like really relevant to his project or to his video at all to define faith this poorly. Perry, I know that in the chat that we had going on Facebook, you had some thoughts on this one. Do you want to share those, or do you want to just get to problem of evil?
I was just gonna say I don't know of any. There's a huge literature on faith now, and I had to compile. I co-wrote the Oxford bibliography of it over the last 20 years or so. There's no one who uses that definition of faith, and who thinks that captures the nature of faith. And most, it seems to me that in general, but this isn't terribly important, but in general, most philosophers who publish on faith don't even think that faith involves belief, and they're going to think that faith is responsive to evidence, right? So you have faith that X, you run into some counter evidence, your faith is going to be weakened. You run into some positive evidence, it's going to be strengthened. So faith is supposed to be responsive to evidence. But anyway, I agree that this is completely tangential, and it doesn't look like it serves any purpose.
All right, well, let's go ahead and continue then in the clips, and now we're getting into the meat. We're getting into... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one way to defend Stephen is there are some Christians who will say things like this: oh, we don't want proof for God's existence, and so otherwise there's no room for faith, right? So they'll say stuff like that. And so, what Stephen's saying, it's not completely out of the blue. Sometimes believers talk like that. Even non-believers will talk that way. I don't know if Perry I have some thoughts on that, but I just want to give a little support to what Stephen's saying.
Yeah, it's definitely true that some people say that. How many? I don't know. Whether those are the ones you should be targeting with an argument, I don't know. But
see, but then to defend those people, I don't think that they're actually, if you were to explain what these terms mean and get them to articulate what's going on internally in their mind, I don't think that they're going to say that this belief just popped out of nowhere and there's no evidence that backed it up. I think what they're going to say is that something like this: it seems to me that God exists. And that would be consistent with Reformed epistemology. It'd be consistent, especially if we broaden our definition of evidence to include something like philosophical seemings or philosophical intuition. I think that most people would actually say that their belief in God, even if they want to put it in terms of faith, it's going to be nevertheless based on some type of evidence, so long as we are broad enough with our definition of evidence, which I think we should be. So to defend those people, I don't think that they would agree that it's based on nothing, that it's based on no evidence at all. I think that they would say that it's more along the basis of something that Stephen sort of appeals to later on in this video, when he appeals to the supposed obviousness of gratuitous suffering. It just seems obvious. And so I think that for these Christians, God's existence just seems obvious. But then to build on top of that, if you actually talk to these people, most of these Christians have quote unquote felt God's presence when they've gone to church, in worship, times of worship, they've felt things, they've experienced things that seem to confirm to them that God exists. And I think that if you press them on this, they would be immediate to cite examples of even like miracles, like friends of theirs who have prayed and got better. And so they would cite, I think if you press them, they would cite various things that actually stand in a sort of support relation for their beliefs. But yeah, I just felt like defending them.
Yeah, I'll make a quick comment, and then I think my section will end, and I look forward to what Perry has to say about the problem of evil. But just to add, I also think some of those people are just thinking like scientific evidence. They've been trained to think that only something only gets to count as evidence if it's scientific. These sorts of seemings don't get to count. And so this is kind of something we talked about, Cameron, which is for atheists out there. I mean, I think here's how a dialectic would go in response to what Cameron just said. It does seem that a lot of believers will report, yeah, it does seem to them that God exists, or they felt God's presence, or they felt God's love, something like that. And I hope that now, one atheist response could just be, okay, yeah, those people might be rational in believing in God. I haven't felt that, so, I'm not rational in believing in God. The next step the dialectic could go is, you could give an argument that God doesn't exist, like the problem of evil, or you could try to give a debunking argument, try to give a explanation for that person's, feeling the presence of God. But then merely stating that isn't enough to show that that person's belief is irrational. Like we just talked about with debunking arguments, you got to give a good argument that those seemings are unreliable. And that's actually going to be quite a challenge. And that's a lot of what philosophers of religion, at least in the epistemology of religion, are working on right now, whether these religious debunking arguments work. So just merely saying, oh, yeah, they felt God's presence, but here's some psychological explanation. Giving a good debunking argument takes a good bit of work. And yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that.
That reminds me, I should actually make the video that I had planned to talk about that subject. Should we take these sort of brain states as evidence that the belief was formed on an unreliable basis? Anyways, very, very interesting question, but let's move on to the other parts of the video. And now we're turning over to Perry. So Perry's first clip is where he lays out, or Stephen lays out, the problem of evil. And I think we're going to play two clips sort of back to back here. So we'll play both of these clips, and then we'll get Perry to respond to it. But first, before we do that, I want to let you guys know that Capturing Christianity is a crowd-funded ministry. We rely on your support to function. You may not know this, but religious YouTube channels like Capturing Christianity, we do not make a whole lot of money from our ad revenue. The reason for that is that not a lot of advertisers are interested in advertising on niche channels like ours that are focused on these sort of big, controversial topics like religion. So like politically charged YouTube channels are in a similar boat, where advertisers are a little bit reluctant to advertise on their videos. So our ad revenue is actually limited in that way. We do not make enough money, nowhere close to be able to support our full-time jobs that we do here at Capturing Christianity. My wife and I are the two full-time employees of Capturing Christianity. We need your support in order to function. I mentioned a few months back at this point that we're running at a deficit in terms of total giving. We are still running at a deficit. I just haven't mentioned it for a number of reasons. I don't like mentioning it, but it is true, and we do need your support. So if you'd like to support Capturing Christianity, you can go to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. Link to that is in the description of this video and in every video. If you do want to pledge your support, there's also things that we give you in return. We do a monthly hangout, a monthly 2-hour hangout every single month with different philosophers and different guests and all sorts of cool different things. Just go check out patreon.com/capturingchristianity. And thank you so much in advance for supporting this ministry and helping to continue to make it grow. And even if you're just watching and you're just liking and you're subscribing, that's a great way to support as well. So thank you for that if that's what you're doing. So all right, let's move on to the next part of the clip here. This one, we're getting in again to the problem of evil. So here we go.
Now we can delve into the juicy parts, and we'll start with the worm in Adam's apple, the problem of evil. By virtue of God being all-powerful, we know that he can prevent evil. And by virtue of him being all-loving, we know that he wants to prevent evil. And yet, when we stroll through the remains of mass extinctions and witness natural disasters, predation, parasitic diseases, and other forms of suffering in the world, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil. That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good. This poses a significant problem for all.
Sorry, I needed to pause it there. So maybe, Perry, is there anything you'd like to say before we play the next clip, or should I just play it?
You can just play the next one.
Okay. Just getting there in the playhead. Here we go.
To really get this on the table, let's consider a few more instances of what appears to be gratuitous evil. Leukemia in children, forest fires that incinerate wildlife, infectious diseases such as malaria, smallpox, and HIV, birth defects that often deform and cripple an animal's capacity to survive. Then we have predators such as lions, crocodiles, and snakes that must, I repeat, must inflict untold horrors on other sentient beings to survive. These predators are designed through evolution or creation to do this. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. God gave them their weapons and ensured that they must use them on the innocent. And what about parasites such as ticks, fleas, and tapeworms, with the life cycle of some consisting of eating their host from the inside out? These teleological evils, we're told, must be for the best somehow. To believe this...
Okay, to believe this, I argue, is to be profoundly irrational. That's what he was going to conclude there. Perry.
Okay. So yeah, there's a couple. I don't know if these are nitpicky, but a few things to start with on how we're defining gratuitous evil. So one that's nitpicky that I won't go into is that we should really be focusing on whether the permission of the evil is gratuitous, not whether the evil itself is gratuitous. That's what philosophers are typically focused on. And so really, we should, like I said, be focusing on whether the permission of the evil is gratuitous. But secondly, there's this other kind of thing going on there is he doesn't state it strongly enough. He can make his argument stronger by saying that the evil, it can't just produce the greater good. It's got to be required for or necessary for the good to, or set of goods to be to obtain, right? But that also leaves out the second half of what gratuitous evil is. And I suspect he could have just left this out due to time constraints or whatever. But, so for an evil to be gratuitous, in addition to it not being required for a greater good or set of goods that outweighs it, its prevention also can't, it also has to be false that its prevention would have, that it being prevented would have produced an evil or set of evils that's equally bad or worse, right? Because if this evil was required to avoid a worse or equally bad evil, you might think it's also permissible. That's at least how philosophers are typically thinking about it. So there's the condition that this evil wasn't required for a greater good or set of goods, and the condition that it was also not required to avoid an equally bad or worse evil. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to pull up the part where he defines gratuitous evil. I'm trying to remember what section it's in.
It's in the first section.
Well, I know it's in the first section. I'm just trying to remember exactly. Evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good. Yeah, and so what you're saying is that this is only part of what it means, at least in the literature, what it means to be gratuitous. So that there's also this doesn't prevent or yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And yeah, he could have just left it out for time constraints, but I'm also making it stronger, right? Because the evil has to be necessary, and I'm just going to say like required for this greater good or greater evil, right? At least that's how philosophers are typically thinking about it. And so okay, that's what gratuitous evil means. And then he has this argument from gratuitous evil. There's sort of two ways you can take his argument. I'll first look at, I think it sort of maps on to what people call the common sense problem of evil. But I'll give if someone really wants to resist that he was relying on intuition in this, I'll I'll give a different, I'll state it in a different way to avoid that issue. But, so he says he holds that gratuitous evil is incompatible with the existence of God. Then we can call that the first premise. The second premise is something like, there's gratuitous evil. And then we can conclude, therefore, that God doesn't exist. Now, I'll talk about the first premise later, whether God's existence is actually incompatible with gratuitous evil or whether there's good reason to think that. So let's grant that for the sake of argument. Then what's the deal with the second premise, right? Like, why should we think that there's gratuitous evil? Well, we're told that it's obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that there's this gratuitous evil, right? And so it sounds like he's saying that it's intuitive. It sounds like the argument is supposed to be that it's really intuitive that there's gratuitous evil. And I think what's going on here, this strikes me as not a good reason, even if it is intuitive to think that there's gratuitous evil. It strikes me as a pretty bad reason to think that there is gratuitous evil, because when we talk about gratuitous evil, it's really masking a complex concept, because as I just laid it out there, we're thinking about whether this evil is, whether it's, let's say, logically connected. Let's say that if the evil was required or necessary for the avoiding another evil, or if it was required or necessary for producing a greater good, let's say it's logically connected to that good and that evil. So whether an evil is gratuitous is a function of the value of all the goods and evils and the prevention of evils that are logically connected to it and its prevention, right? So in order to see whether this is likely gratuitous, we need to know something about all the goods and evils logically connected to it, and we need to sort of tally them up. But when you think about it that way, when you actually understand what a gratuitous evil is, that's pretty nuts to say, like, it's obvious that it's gratuitous, because for it to be obvious, like, for it to be intuitive, you're saying it's intuitive that, like, when we tally up all the weights of all the goods and evils logically connected to it, that it's going to come out in kind of a net negative. It's going to be overall bad or whatever. How could that be something that strikes you as immediately obvious? That'd be really weird, right? Like, it'd be kind of like if, you were standing in front of Mount Baker and you said, hey, Perry, it's really, really obvious, it's intuitive that Mount Baker is the tallest mountain in Washington, right? That'd be really weird, because it depends, whether Mount Baker is the tallest mountain in Washington depends on other mountains in Washington and so on. It depends on the results of this search when you look at all the mountains in Washington to see which one's tallest. Similarly, like, you got to actually add up the goods and evils that are logically connected to the evil to know whether it's gratuitous, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I think it does. There was
I think that if there's an appeal to intuition here, it's a really, like, it's an unjustified intuition. I'm skeptical that anyone actually has these kinds of intuitions. But if people do, it seems like it's pretty clearly unjustified. Like, it does, I think that we have reason to think, to doubt that our intuitions would reliably track these logical connections and tally them up reliably as well.
Yeah, well, this is important. Let me just kind of break down what you just said. So there's basically two components. Help me with the second one to get it correctly. But the first component of a gratuitous evil is that there's no greater good that justifies its permission, and then the second one is
no greater good or set of goods either.
No greater good or set of goods that justifies its permission. But then the second one is that there's no preventing it doesn't allow some greater evil to occur, right?
Equally bad or worse evil. That's right.
Equally bad or worse. So there's these two components that are sort of tied to gratuitous evil. And so your first point is that you're skeptical that people even have that intuition, that gratuitous evil in that sense, like that's the intuition that you're saying. Yeah. You're skeptical that people actually have that. They might have some intuition about something else, like it just seems pointless, right? That may be their intuition.
I mean, here's what I would think is going on. It seems really bad. Like, just like when you see Mount Baker, it seems really tall. But it'd be really weird to go a step further and say, not only does it seem tall, it seems like it's the tallest in Washington, or when it comes to evil, it seems that when you tally up all the goods and evils logically connected to it, it's going to be gratuitous, right?
Well, couldn't they just think what I just said, that it just seems pointless? Like, couldn't that be what they?
Well, then we need to sort of unpack. So in the same way that gratuitous evil masks the complexity of the concept and so can like trick you into thinking it's this real easy seeming to come by, the same thing's going to happen with pointless, right? Because we'll need to spell out what it means for an evil to be pointless.
And then it'd be something like no good reason to allow it or something like that.
But we can also like set aside my skepticism here, because I run into a lot of people are more credulous than me on this issue, and they think that there are these seemings. Here's the other problem: is that we have no good reason to think that our intuitions are sort of like tracking these. Like, do we think that our intuitions are tallying up the goods and evils logically connected to it? And in addition to that, we know that we humans are not good at detecting logical connections between states of affairs. We know that. That's why there's so much philosophical disagreement about everything. There's questions about whether like the right action is necessarily connected to is the action that produces the most good. There's disagreement about whether there's a necessary connection between the mind and the brain, and so on. We disagree widely about all of this. And if we could detect logical connections easily, you wouldn't expect this kind of disagreement. So even if somebody does have this intuition, it's really dubious to think that this intuition is reliably tallying up all that stuff. One, because oh, sorry, go on.
No, my point is not related to. Go ahead and finish.
Oh no, I was just going to reiterate a little bit there.
Oh, okay. I was going to point out that what you're. Yeah, let me get this thought out really quickly before I lose it. Is that what you're doing is you're kind of like undercutting this intuition that it seems like Stephen is appealing to some sort of intuition, especially when he says, I'll pull it back on the screen. He says, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious. It appears obvious. So that seems like an intuition. Maybe he would want to make some distinction here, but the point that I wanted to make is that what you're doing is you're saying that this intuition, this particular intuition, because it's about something that's so specific, and there's other reasons to think that it's dubious, but you're basically saying that this particular intuition is unreliable. But it doesn't follow from that. This is my point. It doesn't follow from that intuition generally is unreliable. All that it means is that in this particular case, we shouldn't rely on these intuitions. So I wanted to make that clear.
Yeah,
because some people think that if we're skeptical about this intuition, we've got to be skeptical about basically everything, and I'm saying that doesn't follow.
Yeah, so I mean, if somebody says that they have the intuition that Mount Baker is the tallest mountain in Washington without having going and checked out all the other mountains, to say that intuition is pretty unjustified, it's unjustified or undercut, that's not to say that intuition is trash in general. It's just to say that intuition is trash.
Yeah. Okay, Andrew, what did you have a thought or a question?
Yeah, I'm curious, Perry, where you maybe this, you can stop me if I'm getting a little too ahead. You think that, like, how could people have an intuition about the gratuitousness defined in terms of logical entailments or necessary connections to goods and evils? And is it because you think most people aren't really thinking about possible goods or possible evils or possible necessary connections? Is it because I think for a lot of people in their mind, they are thinking about like some goods that they're seeing are not coming out of this. They might not be thinking carefully about entailments though, which is what they need. So I'm kind of wondering, like, what's the source of the skepticism? Is it that they really haven't thought about goods or the evils or the entailment relations? You get what I'm asking?
Yeah, so I mean, so I do want to allow that there are people who have this. I think it's secondary because I think it's undermined. But people have lots of weird intuitions, so people might have this. But yeah, my source is like, it's just when we just talk about gratuitous evil, it really masks how complex this is, and I don't think people realize if we were to if you spell out what you mean by gratuitous evil, I think that people would cease to have any intuition. Maybe they do when they just have this vague gratuitous evil in mind, but once you sort of spell out what's in mind, I think that a lot of people are going to no longer say that they have this intuition. But this is a pretty unpopular view. I think I said it at that conference a couple of years back that at Virginia, and it was not well received. But my skepticism hasn't changed. But yeah, it's relatively secondary though, because I do think even if there are people with these intuitions, they are unjustified intuitions.
But okay, I'll try one more time. I might not be being clear here, because I think in people's mind they are thinking like this evil isn't connected to any good, and so they have a set of goods in mind that the evil could bring about, like maybe happiness or something. They have a set of evils that it might prevent, maybe certain instances of suffering, and I think they do have a grasp of that. What they might not have a grasp of is like entailment relations, or just the idea maybe they're not grasping that there might be goods they haven't thought of. So I'm just wondering, what's the part in it that you think they're not grasping, the goods part or the entailments part?
I think largely what's going on is the goods and the entailment relation, and then also the fact that we have to tally up the weight of all of these goods and evils.
I see.
That I think the tallying up is also a big thing. Like, it's weird to think that you could do that immediately by this intuition. Like, we have to like weigh them. You can't just like. I would just be repeating my point about mountains. It doesn't strike me as something that you can do immediately. Is just weigh all these things that are supposed to be logically connected.
Okay.
I was going to say that someone in the comments is saying that this is like a really bad objection to the problem of evil. How would you respond to that?
This isn't the problem of evil, right? This is the common sense. This is the common sense version, and part of that is supposed to be that this proposition a lot of people find intuitive, and I'm skeptical about that. I think that there's probably a few. But this isn't like a main objection. This is just some skepticism that people aren't really thinking hard about what gratuitous evil is. I think that's, sorry guy on the internet if that wasn't enough there. But my second issue, I guess, is the one that I think is more damning, is that we have reason to doubt that our intuitions are going to be reliably track the value of all these goods and evils logically connected to some instance of evil, because we know that we're bad at detecting logical connections, right? So I don't know, if you're going to focus on one of them, I would suggest focusing on the second one. But I did mention the first one more, I suppose.
Yeah. So the second, well, maybe it's important to actually just mention the name of the approach that you're taking here, skeptical theism. I think did you mention that earlier? I can't remember if you did or not. But this is basically the.
Yeah, it's rooted in some skeptical theism, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah,
and it's a terrible name for what it is, but there's no other name that we've come up with yet to name it. But yeah, I mean, it's what's interesting to me is that atheists, I think, should actually, or at least skeptics. Let me use the term skeptics. I think skeptics should actually be on board with skeptical theism, because it does something that they're fans of, skepticism. So that's basically what it is. And if you have any familiarity with trying to give arguments in the context of like a philosophy of religion, debate forum, or anything like that, it's actually really difficult to forward or like give a successful argument for some important conclusion. Just in philosophy more generally, that's also true there. And so people are always trying to level skepticism against arguments. And so if you're a skeptic, I mean, you should be open to this kind of skepticism. So that's at least one reason why you should embrace what Perry's saying here.
I mean, so one, in defense of the name, I don't know. I like the name. It's catchy. But no one else seems to. It's also something everyone should endorse. Like, we know that we're not good at detecting these logical connections between states of affairs. But whether an evil is gratuitous depends on the weight of all these logical connections, right, of the goods and evils. That is going to undermine any intuition you have about it, right? So I think it's a pretty powerful reason to doubt this kind of intuition if anyone has it,
So, okay, you've given your response to the problem, this section, which is basically the common sense version of the problem of evil. One of my issues with this, I mean, I depending on the day, I'm either like a skeptical theist or I'm a skeptical of skeptical theism. So I'm kind of all over the place on that. But one thing that I'm not as all over the place of is the theodicy that I like the most is the soul building theodicy. What a theodicy is, for those that are just hearing this word for the first time, it's a reason why God might allow evil and suffering. So well, maybe that's a bad definition. That's more of like a definition of a defense, where it's something that's a possible reason God might have. A theodicy is literally a reason that God has to allow pain and suffering. And so the reason that I think God allows pain and suffering, the one that I'm most persuaded by, is what's referred to as soul building in the literature. And what was sad to me is that Stephen didn't mention any theodicies. I think he did mention the word theodicy at some point. I can't remember if it played in the clip that we played just now or not. But he mentioned the word, but he didn't actually address any popular theodicies like the free will theodicy or soul building or natural law or like any of the others that have been forwarded by philosophers for literally thousands of years. So I would have liked to see some more interaction with that. Now, in his defense, this was a 10-minute video. It was meant to be like a 10-minute opening, so he may just not have had time to go into that. But if it were me, I would have addressed that instead of giving the argument that he gives at the very end, which wasn't really clear, whether he was giving an argument from religious disagreement or hiddenness. It wasn't clear. I would have just cut that part out and focused more time on responding to various theodicies, because theodicies have been offered by Christians, and there are very sophisticated defenses of these, and really plausible ones, by my lights at least. And so that's the response to the problem of evil that I prefer, is soul building. That these evils that occur in our lives, it doesn't matter which one it is, whether it's brought about by natural disasters or by moral agents, it doesn't matter what it's brought about by. What matters is that these create opportunities. The evils in our lives, the suffering that we experience, provides the opportunity to exemplify different great character traits like courage and love and sacrifice and forgiveness. And so those great goods sort of justify the permission of suffering. And so that's the approach that I prefer when it comes to the problem of evil. But Perry, I know that go ahead. Yeah, feel free to.
Well, I mean, I think you can be a skeptical theist and endorse theodicy, but set that aside. Are you thinking of the soul building theodicy as being all encompassing, accounting for all evils, or are you thinking that there's multiple distinct reasons?
I'm open to there being certain instances of evil that wouldn't be explained by soul building. However, I think they all could be in principle. As I've thought about it. Yeah. Well, I'm also like, I'm a big fan of the work by Trent Doherty on the problem of evil, and he extends the soul building theodicy to animals as well. So that's the way that that animal suffering is accounted for in his view. It's almost like a Christian version of Narnia. It's really interesting. What are you doing, Andrew?
Wait, a Christian version of Narnia? Isn't that just called Narnia?
Well, like, you know what I mean? Like a Christianity mixed with Narnia. Like the two kind of joined together. So yeah, but yeah, Narnia is basically a version of Christianity. But yeah, so I think in principle it could potentially cover every single case. So yeah. Well, should we move on to the next clip?
Well, maybe we should also say one real brief thing. So suppose that because he did, trash intuition prior in the video. So maybe the thought is that this guy wants to say like, no, this argument isn't based on intuition. You've misdiagnosed it. This isn't the common sense problem of evil. The thought is that we have looked around at all these theodicies, all these potential reasons that would justify God in allowing evil, and none of them work. And since none of them work, that means for what we're able, for our current sort of weight on the scale of whether it's gratuitous or not, favors it being gratuitous. And so he wants to say, since we see no reason, there is no such reason. Now, anyone who's like read anything on skeptical theism will know that this sort of inference is going to be vulnerable to skeptical theism. Skeptical theists doubt really generally that we have this a very good grasp of what God's reasons would be. So the fact that we don't, if he exists, right? So the fact that we don't know of any such reason isn't going to be good evidence that there is no such reason. So if we're framing this in a way that's not the common sense problem of evil, I think it's going to succumb to skeptical theism, as most arguments do. Although Cameron would want to say, well, look, you're wrong about the soul-building theodicy. It actually is it is a good theodicy or whatever.
Yeah, I would defend that to my death. Let's move on to the next clip. This one I'm really interested in getting into is the whether or not gratuitous suffering is compatible with God's existence, because he flat out says that it's not. And let's just play the clip here.
Disasters, predation, parasitic diseases, and other forms of suffering in the world, it appears obvious, and I mean really, really obvious, that we're beset by gratuitous evil. That is, evil that does not serve any greater purpose or lead to any greater good. This poses a significant problem for all followers of this classical God. By maintaining that an all-powerful and all-loving God exists, theists are committed to a worldview that cannot admit of any gratuitous evil whatsoever. None. To them, every single instance of gratuitous evil must necessarily be an illusion. So when, for instance, we discuss a mass extinction in which millions of sentient beings suffer horrendous and often prolonged deaths, rather than recognizing that, yes, gratuitous evil exists, theists have to spin a story,
There we go. So yeah, let's stop it there and talk about just the specific part, whether or not gratuitous suffering is in fact compatible with God's existence, which is one of the premises, like if you wanted to put his argument deductively, and I think you kind of did it earlier, like premise 1 would be something like, if God exists, no gratuitous evil exists. Premise 2, gratuitous evil does exist. So by Mullis Tollens, it follows that God does not exist. So the first premise is the one that we're looking at now, whether or not God's existence implies the absence of any gratuitous suffering. So Perry, take it away.
Right. So this is extremely controversial. I suspect that most philosophers are going to accept the view that if God exists, there's no gratuitous evil. But I don't know. I think that if we focus on philosophers of religion who write about the problem of evil, I think it's getting a bit more sketchy. I think that there's a lot less certainty there because there's been quite a few relatively powerful arguments given against or for thinking that God's existence is compatible with gratuitous evil, and not really any positive arguments for that view. I mean, Rowe just says it seems to be true, and that seems to be what a lot of people are also relying on here. So there's been for example, Mike Peterson, John Hick, Mike Almeida, William Hasker, Peter Van Wegen, Justin Mooney, and so on have all raised challenges to this view, but I'll just talk about a couple of them. So one is, I'll start with Peter Van Wegen. So he identifies this moral principle that William Rowe is relying on, and he states the principle this way. He says, if one is in a position to prevent some evil, one should not allow that evil to occur, not unless allowing it to occur would result in some good that would outweigh it, or preventing it would result in some evil at least as bad. So that's kind of what he thinks the moral principle at work behind Rowe's argument is. And that seems like that's the right interpretation. That's basically what we define gratuitous evil as earlier. And what Van Wegen does is, well, I'll make it a little more simple. He provides a counterexample to this moral principle, which, if right, is going to show that this moral principle is false. So he asks us to consider a judge, a good judge who is trying to pass down a just sentence. And this thief has been caught. And because of this, the judge has to sentence the thief to some time in jail. Now, the judge's sole purpose for putting the thief in jail is to deter other criminals from committing, to deter other people from committing similar crimes. And the judge hands down a sentence of 10 years. But the lawyer for the thief comes up and she says something like, Judge, you shouldn't cause this kind of suffering unless it's required for a greater good or required to prevent, the occurrence of an evil that's equally bad or worse. But, you could get the same deterrence effect if you just did 10 years minus 1 nanosecond. no person who is going to steal stuff is going to be deterred, would have been deterred by 10 years, but will not also be deterred by 10 years minus 1 nanosecond, right? And the judge says, you know what, that sounds right. And so she amends the sentence to 10 years minus 1 nanosecond. But then, the lawyer for the thief comes up again and says, Judge, you want to be perfectly good and align with this moral principle, right? But you could get the same deterrence effect if you do 10 years minus 2 nanoseconds instead of just 10 years minus 1 nanosecond. And then the judge says, yeah, that seems right. So she reduces the sentence again. And this will go on until we reach a sentence of 0 nanoseconds, or even like 2 nanoseconds for that matter. But once we reach that point, we'll have 0 deterrence effect. There will be the entire good will be lost. And so Van Wagen's point is like, well, in order to get this deterrence effect, which is supposed to be this good, right? The judge has to make a somewhat arbitrary decision, a somewhat arbitrary cutoff, and provide some sentence. And for whatever sentence she gives, she could have given a slightly less sentence and gotten the same good. But the judge hasn't done anything wrong here. There's nothing impermissible she's done. Otherwise, she wouldn't have gotten this good at all. That's kind of and if that's true, and if the judge hasn't done anything wrong, then this moral principle is false. And that's to say that God's existence would be compatible with gratuitous evil because that moral principle is false. Does that make sense? Was that intuitive?
Yes. Yeah, it was. I don't really have anything to add to that. Andrew, did you want to respond or say anything?
He looks very worried, like an objection's coming.
Sorry, guy. I just been thinking so much about the skeptical theism and all of these great issues. Anyway, do you think Van Wagen's view requires there to be metaphysical vagueness? Sorry, this might only interest people.
It definitely does. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's all. It's the idea that vagueness is really in the world. Vagueness isn't just a matter of language or knowledge or something. That there really are blurry, not sharp cutoffs.
And that's going to be controversial.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, this to me, what this reminds me of, this response to the analogy that you just gave about the judge and everything, reminds me of a paper by Daniel Howard Snyder. He's got this really great paper. I think he wrote it in like 1998 or 1999. I think it's just called The Problem of Evil. And he lays out, like, he gives all these different reasons or theodicies that theists have offered. And then he says, really what you're looking for is the reason, like the thing that justifies all the suffering in the world. But probably what it's going to be is like a conjunction of like all of these different reasons. So that's what you're actually looking for. But at the end of it, after surveying several, he says, well, none of these seem to really justify every single case. And then he says, it seems like you could at least, even if you grant that these theodicies explain most of the suffering in the world, it's not going to explain why there's so much suffering in the world. So the atheist might say there's too much suffering. And so I think that's what Van Wagen's point, one of the points of interaction here is, whoops, your screen went black for a second. But I think that's one of the points where this view from Van Wagen interacts with the atheist or the skeptic or the problem of evil forwarder who wants to say that there's so much or there's too much suffering in the world. And then Van Wagen is going to say, well, you could say that about any amount of suffering. Like if God allows any amount of suffering, you could always say, well, why that? You could always say, well, let's subtract like this one horrendous case. And atheists are really good at picking out horrendous cases. That's actually another interesting paper that I won't mention, but yeah, so that's what sort of stood out to me, is that when people say like there's too much suffering, I think that's where this really interacts and sort of undercuts that intuition.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, so Van Wagen's just floating this as, he wouldn't want to put this as a theodicy in the way that like he's more defending this as a possibility, right? So one qualification there in the way that you're saying that. But yeah. So that, do you want me to say anything more about Van Wagen's view, or do you want me to talk about different?
Yeah, maybe mention one other account.
Yeah. So so William Hasker has this interesting argument where he says something like this: like, suppose that it's true that God would never allow gratuitous evil. If that's the case, then we know that for any evil that obtains, any evil there is, it's going to, the permission of it is going to bring about some greater good or prevent some equally bad or worse evil, such that it is, it's so good it's going to be able to justify government. But, if we know that, that is going to really undermine our moral motivation. Like if it's true that, every instance of evil out there produces some greater good or set of goods or prevents some equally bad or worse evil or set of evils, then we don't have, it's not so urgent to, respond to famine or respond to earthquakes or prevent serious, horrendous actions that are happening. It takes away one of your strongest reasons for intervening. And he talks about this in terms of psychology, but we can psychologically it might make you less inclined to do this, but we can also just think about normative reasons. Like you just lack you don't have, it's not as urgent in terms of you don't have a very strong reason to go and do these things to help those who are suffering under famine or whatever. It's just a much less strong reason you have to do that than we originally thought. And because of that, he says, God wants us to be morally motivated. He wants us part of, it could be that he wants us to, have significant moral freedom as well. And because of that, he allows gratuitous evil. Because if we didn't have that, again, a lot of the tragedies we see are just not as urgent as we're inclined to think they are to address. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm not as persuaded by that one, although I think it does have some force. I think there's something
think
to that
about
one.
any instance of evil you see, you're thinking okay, should I help with this? No, it'll lead to a greater good. Or if I prevent it, it's going to happen if it's, so that this famine is happening, which must mean that the permission of it does lead to this great good or the prevention of equally bad or worse evil. Doesn't that seem to make you well, maybe it's not so urgent that I help stop that or whatever?
Well, to me, I'm not a consequentialist. So because I've thought about my views on morality, I'm not really persuaded by that type of argument. But I would be persuaded to help, because I think that the greatest goods that can be exemplified in the world are these goods that I mentioned earlier with respect to soul building and stuff. So I would think of that as an opportunity to build character and be courageous and help others and everything. And so that would be sort of my motivation, would be to bring about these greatest goods, and then also alleviate the suffering of others and everything. So that I wouldn't really reason in the consequentialist type framework that maybe others would be drawn to.
Can I jump in?
You look like you have something to say.
Yeah. I don't really think of it as moral motivation, but just the plausibility of whether God would have given us the ability to make the world overall better or worse. And whether that's a good thing. So this isn't my example. Actually, Philip Swenson told me that John Pittard gave it. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, the main character. I think I can give this. So it's not too soon. It's been a while, out for a while. But the main character kind of gets to this hard stage in life, and an angel allows him to see a world where this is what the world would have been like if you had died as a young person, or if you had never lived. And it turns out that the town is much, much worse off because he had never lived. And I think it's good that that main character had the ability to make the world a better place. Now think of how the movie would have been if this had happened. If the angel had been like, here's what the world would have looked like if you had never existed. And it's exactly the same. The guy actually didn't make any difference to how good the world was. And then it seems, wow, something's lost if we don't have the ability to affect overall goodness or badness of the world. So it seems like it's a good thing for God to give us the ability to make the world better or worse. But if God's really giving us the ability to do that, then it's going to allow for the possibility that, things would be worse off than they were, and overall worse. And so that would be a gratuitous evil. I don't know if that moves you a little bit, but
I think it does. Yeah, that moves me quite a bit. But the point It looks okay, Perry. I didn't know if you were frozen. The point so far that we're discussing right now is whether or not God's existence is compatible with the existence of gratuitous suffering that is basically pointless. But we need to get more specific with gratuitous suffering, the definition of it. But the point is whether or not it's compatible. And what Stephen says here is that it's obviously incompatible. Like, there's no gratuitous suffering that can exist if God exists. And so what we're pointing out is that there are several different accounts that exist in the literature of people that are tried to compatibilize gratuitous suffering with God's existence. Very clever attempts, very interesting attempts, attempts that are at least worthy of mention. One of the things that I wondered about when I watched this was, is Stephen even aware of this literature? I don't know if he is. It didn't seem like he is to be so confident about what he's saying. So that's a worry. That's a concern of mine. If you're making these videos,
so maybe we can
debate. Go ahead.
Maybe it's worth putting the point this way then. So one, it's controversial whether God's existence is compatible with gratuitous evil. Two, there have been a pretty good number of arguments given for thinking they are compatible. And three, there really aren't positive arguments for thinking that they are not compatible, that God's existence is incompatible with gratuitous evil. Again, Rowe just says, this seems true to me. And so given those facts, it seems like a pretty substantial defense of that premise is needed. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And it could be that he just ran out of time and space. And so had it been a longer video, he would have taken that on. So.
Can I add just a quick recommendation? The Analytic Christian, Jordan Hampton's channel, has a really nice interview. It's called Examining Arguments for the Compatibility of God and Gratuitous Evil. And it just covers all of those. So if anybody wants to explore that, I would recommend that video.
Yeah, so go check that out. Go check out Jordan's channel regardless. The Analytic Christian is worth subscribing to for sure. He's got great interviews that he does and short animated videos he produces. Very, very, very good content. All right, let's move on to the second to last clip, which is the Evil God Challenge. This one starts at 5:30. Let me go ahead and skip forward in my timeline. Pull up my screen and start.
In my experience, theists tend to fail in grasping the irrationality at play here, and so let me flip the script through the work of Stephen Law. Suppose that I believed in an all-powerful and all-evil God, which entails that he has unlimited power and will always act as to create the greater evil. And when I'm presented with something that's seemingly obviously good, such as children playing as they cultivate lifelong friendships and love, I argue that this is an illusion of good. Can't you see that God has intentionally allowed for moments of good as a way to intensify the suffering that follows? After all, if you didn't love that person before God gave them cancer, then you wouldn't have experienced the pain that you still do, even to this day. God is wise in his cruelty, don't you know? Then suppose you gave me countless other examples of seemingly obvious good, and yet I didn't budge. At all. No, I confidently declare, this all might appear rather lovely, but I assure you, this must be for the worst, somehow. Technically,
All right.
One little nitpicky thing. So the ending of this clip reminded me to mention this. So he talks about how theists, God's existence is incompatible with gratuitous evil. And so in response to any instance of evil that someone might argue is gratuitous, they have to say, this must be for the best somehow. Note that doesn't follow, right? So whether an evil is gratuitous is just a matter of whether it being in the world makes it better or it being out of it would make it worse, right? So whether you have to say no, the world is better because of this evil. You don't have to say it's best. So and because you don't want to have to commit yourself to the view that God would create the best possible world, because that's also very contentious. So there is something that comes apart right there. Something that doesn't follow. Anyway, so he's talking about the evil God challenge here. And there's at least a couple ways to understand the evil God challenge, but the way that he's doing it is the way that I think is the most natural interpretation of law. Law wobbles a little bit between the ways that he, gives the gives the evil God challenge. But the evil God challenge can be stated something like this, So let's say that maltheism is the view that there's an evil God. Theism is the view that God exists, right? God is perfectly good or whatever. So the evil God challenge starts by noting, it claims that, first, the evidence is roughly equal between maltheism and theism, right? So any argument, or at the very least, most arguments that can be given on behalf of theism can also be given on behalf of maltheism. So, maybe you think the Kalam cosmological argument is sound. Well, that doesn't tell us about the moral creator of the universe,
the moral
right?
nature of the
so
creator.
That's going to... What was that?
It doesn't tell us about the moral nature of the creator.
Yeah. So it equally supports both the existence of God and evil God. So it equally supports maltheism and theism. This is going to be contentious, but let's grant that that's true for all arguments for theism. So they have roughly an equal prior here. And then the next claim is that basically any theodicy that you can give for theism, so any reason you might identify for God, why God would probably allow evil, the maltheists can give for maltheism. They can say, evil God allows evil because of, you could reverse the free will theodicy and say that evil done by free creatures is worse than evil done by, not creatures who aren't free. But to have truly free creatures, evil God has to allow for the possibility of good, and that explains some kind of good. Right. And the thought here is that if we grant that all theodicies can be reversed with equal plausibility, which is a very contentious assumption and dubious assumption to make, but if that's the case, then we have not only are theism and maltheism on roughly equal evidential standing, it's also true that the problem of good and the problem of evil are roughly equally powerful. And then the final step is, so once you have that, if you think that the problem of good, so the problem of reconciling the existence of evil God with certain known facts about good, like its intensity, its distribution, and so on, if you think the problem of good is a decisive argument against maltheism, then since the problem of good is roughly equally powerful to the problem of evil, you should think that the problem of evil is a decisive argument against theism. That's what's going on here, and there's quite a few contentious assumptions made here. But let me flag my what I think is the right response here. It's that neither this guy nor Stephen Law has actually developed an argument for good, or actually given us any reason to think that goodness is strong evidence against maltheism. And the fact is that if we accept skeptical theism, which we should, because it's true, we shouldn't think that the problem of good is decisive evidence against maltheism, and we shouldn't even think it's a good argument against maltheism. The fact is that given that we aren't good at detecting logical connections between goods and evils, and that's whether they're connected to an instance of evil or whether they're connected to an instance of good. But then we can't tell whether, in the same way that we can't tell whether an evil is gratuitous, we also can't tell whether a good is gratuitous. And that undermines this problem of good. But then, if that's the case, if the problem of good isn't decisive evidence against maltheism, then it's not going to follow that the problem of evil is decisive evidence against theism. And so that's where I think he goes wrong here. But since you're not so inclined towards skeptical theism, there are other responses that have been given to this.
Do you want to go into them, or do you want
to? I can just mention them. You can.
Yeah, sure.
It would actually go. It would take so Ben Page and Max Baker Hitch. That seems wrong.
Maybe I'm saying it wrong.
No, I think you're. I'm terrible with pronunciation, but Baker Hitch. They have a page they have a paper that responds to the Evil God Challenge, and they try to show, part of it is to show that these theodicies really can't be reversed, and the law is a bit flippant here. He doesn't really develop them very well, how you could reverse the theodicies. But I think that it's just really clear, it's obvious, and really, really obvious, that the problem of good isn't this devastating problem for maltheism. There might be other reasons that belief in evil God is irrational, but I don't think it's the problem of good.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't
What
develop
do you,
arguments for the existence of God based on the good in the world.
yeah, so I mean, what do you two think of the problem of good? I've never actually run into someone who thought it was a good argument against maltheism, and it's just Law just insists in his paper. He says everybody thinks, typically theists, when they're confronted with the problem of good, they think that that's just decisive evidence against maltheism. But I've never run into anyone who thinks it's decisive evidence. But
Yeah, same. I mean, maybe what he has benefit of doing is asking very specific questions to students and then getting responses, like specific responses that he wants. So maybe that's what was going on with that. So I can't really say, like, but I've never had that thought. I've never seen anyone with that thought or heard anyone with that thought. So yeah.
yeah, and there's other. So the second version of the evil God challenge is, like, why should we think that God is good instead of evil? And that's not going on in this video, but it is relevant, right? Like, so there are lots of so there's different, like, Luke Wilson has a paper where he argues that God is intrinsically more probable than evil God, and so there are reasons you might think too that evil God is less likely than God or something like that. So there are reasons you might have for favoring theism over maltheism here, even once we say that the problem of good isn't really strong evidence against maltheism.
Yeah, it's not clear to me. I mean, to kind of like draw together some of the threads of the whole conversation, like, it's not really obvious to me the way that Stephen is making his argument for the irrationality of theism based on how he defined his terms earlier on in the video. He just kind of says, like, this just seems like an irrational story. And even like in the clip that we haven't played yet toward the end, where he's talking about like religious disagreement and maybe hiddenness, he just says, in this I suppose, or I say is ultimately irrational, or something along those lines. We'll play that clip so we can hear exactly how he says it. But I just don't really see, and it could just be a fault of my, like, I'm not creative enough or intelligent enough to see the way that his argument is actually being structured here. I can't see the connection between we have the problem of evil here, and then theism is irrational. Like, to me, that doesn't follow, because you could have positive evidence for theism that outweighs the negative evidence that you get from the problem of evil. So it's not obvious just because you like forward this one argument that theism is made irrational or anything along those lines. And then even when you introduce like the evil God challenge, like, it's not clear how that makes belief in God irrational. Because like you said, like, I don't think anyone thinks that the problem of good is like decisive evidence against maltheism. There's all sorts of things that are going on that there's a lot of holes in the narrative, as someone might say. So Andrew, it looked like you wanted to say something, or Perry, I can't remember.
I mean, I'll say I think that's right. So if we're talking about whether, especially like, let's suppose that we're adopting this evidentialist point of view, then we need to know about the total evidence, not just one particular piece or even two or three. And so what you're saying is right. Like, even if it's true that the problem of evil was strong evidence against theism, it can be counterbalanced. We need to, so if you're trying to show that it's irrational, and by that you're meaning it's just extremely improbable, you need to consider all the evidence on offer, which you, it's a common mistake made, but he was also making a 10-minute video. So I guess can't hold it against him too much, because in a 10-minute video, you can't examine.
Well, I mean, to me, a way to mitigate that would be to say, there's a lot more to talk about, and I could address all the arguments for theism and stuff, and in the end, I've determined that they're no good or whatever. So you could at least like mention some other pieces that are going on. That's maybe a way of mitigating it. Yeah. He may not have thought of that option, or may not have thought that.
Or maybe just say theism is irrational unless there are other positive reasons to endorse it that outweigh this or something. That'd be pretty simple.
Exactly. So there are ways of avoiding the sort of concern that we're bringing up here. But let's play the last clip. The last clip is the longest clip that we've played so far. It's 2 minutes long. I also apologize. My computer is not powerful enough to do what I'm trying to make it do, which is like play different cameras and also play from YouTube and stuff. I'm actually considering, because we stream in 4K, I'm considering upgrading our computer to a better computer that can do what it needs to do. So what you're seeing, it's not tricks on your eyes, it actually is kind of laggy a bit when we play these clips. So the last clip, we're not going to really comment on too much. I'll explain why after I actually play it. This is the last part. He moves on from the problem of evil and discusses a new problem, which I don't really know how to categorize. It's sort of like a mix between religious disagreement and the argument from divine hiddenness. So I wish he would have spent more time on this, maybe in a separate video, and maybe he will after listening to this. I don't know. But I'd like to hear him develop his thoughts a little bit more carefully and clearly and lengthy on this topic that he brings up here. But let's go ahead and give it a listen.
According to the vast majority of theists, God, in his goodness, offers salvation, and the lack of accepting this great gift is of eternal consequence. In the case of many of you listening today, a condition of salvation is conviction in a set of propositions. For example, that God as defined exists, that Jesus resurrected, or that Gabriel spoke to Muhammad. Hence, if I die as I am now, a non-believer, I face at best annihilation, and at worst, eternal torment. Yes, some theists believe that eventually all will go to heaven. But this belief, universalism, is today as it has always been, a fringe view that requires such a vague interpretation of scripture as to give the idea that God doesn't ordain slavery a run for its money. This threat of eternal torment is terrifying enough, but it gets worse. Most Christians, let alone Muslims and Jews, can't even agree on what's necessary for salvation, and their disagreements are only growing every year. Hence, most theists agree that salvation is necessary to avoid eternal catastrophe, and yet they do not agree on what's necessary to avoid it. Tying these threads alone yields a story of ludicrous contradiction. Despite being told that the mind of God is inconceivable to us mere mortals, we do apparently know that he acts for the greater good, and that this all-powerful, all-loving, unembodied mind has created a hoop for us to jump through. A hoop that, in his mysterious ways, he's made to appear very unlikely to exist at all. And of those that are nevertheless convinced of the hoop's existence, they don't agree on what it looks like, what it's made of, or where it's located. And of course, for those of us so made as not to see the hoop, instead being perplexed by the millions arguing for their favoured contradiction, we'll be eternally forsaken. Which, altogether now, must be for the best somehow. I propose that this is the most absurd, ridiculous, irrational tale ever sold, and it's bought with emotional currency, not rationality.
All right, so that's the very last clip. Again, this one seemed to be kind of mixing in like a few different areas. It seemed to touch on religious disagreement. It seemed to touch on the argument from divine hiddenness, and then I also picked up hints of the problem of the unevangelized. So I was hearing like all sorts of different objections kind of woven into one, and then at the very end he kind of like announces this is the most irrational tale ever sold, which to me one of the things I like to do when I analyze an argument is look at the different premises, see whether or not the conclusion actually follows from the premises, and then in turn look and analyze each premise by itself and ask, is there good reason to think that this premise is true? And so in the case of this argument, that's what I would have to sit down and do, is really sit down and analyze it. So Perry, unless you have any thoughts that you want to share, I'm actually going to point people to another video response that's already been done. So if you're interested in hearing what other Christians, younger Christian apologists actually have to say about this last portion of the video, I want to point you to a video that is made by a guy named Than. I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but his YouTube channel is called Exploring Reality. I've got it linked in the description of this video. They address Stephen Woodford's entire video, and they discuss this portion of the video as well for quite a while. So their discussion, we've all three of us, I think, have listened to at least portions of it. So really interesting content. I want to point you guys over there if you're interested in a Christian response to that portion of the video. We're not really going to address it here in this one, but I want to point you guys over to their channel and go check out their video, go subscribe to their work. So Perry, feel free to share any thoughts that you do have if you want to. Otherwise, we can go ahead and wrap it up.
I agree. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in it. My response is I just think it runs afoul of skeptical theism. And well, and there's a lot of other nitpicky things, but I won't go into those. So yeah, you can point away unless Andrew has something he wants to add.
Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for us today. This has been very fun. I actually really like to sit down and analyze stuff like this in depth. And so we took this as slow as we wanted to. Andrew, I'm actually surprised that you didn't get into that paradox that you shared with us yesterday on the phone. I would have liked to maybe get into some of those issues. Maybe we can save that for another video, another stream. But roughly what it was about. Why don't we go ahead and just talk about it now? We've got maybe a couple minutes, if you guys are okay with it. Let's talk about it just a little bit as we wrap up the show. And so the thought was that it can actually be, and it's not even very controversial, that certain sets of beliefs can be contradictory, and that's okay. Which is it has some very interesting implications for this whole subject. What does it mean for a belief to be irrational? So go ahead and talk about the paradox that you were mentioning to us on the phone yesterday.
Yeah. So this goes
Okay.
back to the very beginning of the video about 2 hours ago. That part where Stephen Woodford defines rationality as being in accordance with or based on logic or reason. Now, I was mainly pointing out that um, being in accordance with logic and reason is not a sufficient condition for having rational belief. But another point is that it's not really necessary either. So you can be not in accord with or out of step with logic and reason, but still have rational beliefs. So people who want more than my 1 or 2 minute summary can just Google lottery paradox or preface paradox. I think preface paradox is better, but here's how the preface paradox goes. Let's say I'm an author and I've carefully researched every sentence of my 500-page book that I've written. Okay, so for every sentence, and I've done my due diligence, and for every sentence, I would say I believe that sentence for 500 pages. Okay, it seems like in this case, we can imagine a case where the author is rational in believing every single sentence in the book, each sentence. So we can call like sentence 1, S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. And that's going to form a whole set, okay, of sentences. Now, here's also a very rational stance to take, to believe that you made at least one error. After all, you've written 500 pages worth in this book. Then it seems rational to believe that you made at least one error. Okay, if we've gotten to this point, then this set of beliefs is contradictory because it's impossible for all the sentences in the book to be true, and yet for at least one of them to be false. So now you have a set of beliefs that is contradictory, or it entails an explicit contradiction. So this is a preface paradox. I've kind of simplified it a little bit actually, and so and it seems like this person, all of their beliefs for each individual sentence is a rational belief, and also the belief that they made at least one error is also a rational belief, but it's contradictory. These sorts of issues are so difficult, actually. There's this book by David Christensen called, let's see, Putting Logic in Its Place. And the whole book is devoting to figuring out, okay, if that's true, then exactly how does logic constrain rationality? And it's no easy matter at all. So that's the preface paradox. There's also lottery paradox, which is similar, but I think one is enough.
Yeah, that was good. I mean, it didn't seem too far out of field. We were asking on the question on the phone yesterday. We were like, is it okay to go on some of these tangents and stuff? And I think that yeah, it's totally cool. And philosophy is super fun. It's super interesting. And I know Perry's a big skeptical theism advocate, but skeptical theism is, I guess, is somewhat fun. But philosophy in general is pretty fun.
Yeah, I think also it helps when I see YouTube commenters. They'll say, oh, the problem is your logic. And they really haven't thought carefully what they mean by logic, whether technically or generally. And so I think it's good that to get a clearer idea. And I would argue that you shouldn't equate logic with rationality. And Stephen's channel is called Rationality Rules, so like people who are fans of Stephen will want a good idea of how rationality is distinct from logic. So just throw that in there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I feel like we could talk for a whole lot longer, and we probably could. There's all sorts of things that are coming to my mind as you went through that paradox, and then as we're thinking about like what is the correct definition of rationality. We didn't even really get into that subject. I lean toward a proper functionalist understanding, and there's just all sorts of really fun topics that we could discuss. But it's been a lot of fun. I'm really interested to see if Stephen makes a response to this, or if he doesn't, if he just moves on to other projects. That's totally cool too. Again, this was not meant to be like an attack on Stephen or anything like that. He and I are actually friends at this point. We just wanted to analyze some of the things that he said in this video. Oh, was there something I wanted to mention earlier when we were giving the definition of gratuitous evil, is that he might have wanted to include, if he was going to make the video longer, he would have included the second concomitant of the definition of gratuitous evil, where you're also thinking about the prevention of worse evils, or equal or worse. So he may have just had that as a sort of parenthetical that he didn't explicitly mention in the video. So, and then also I think that he also doesn't actually think that all theists are irrational. According to my sources, he doesn't actually believe that, even though he argued for that in this video and says it in the title and says it throughout the video. He doesn't actually believe that. So that's good, I guess. But
that would suggest that the video isn't reliable, which means that we need to reject the conclusions of it.
Yeah. Maybe so. Well, thanks to Dr. Andrew Moon and to Dr. Perry Hendricks for taking the time to come on to Capturing Christianity to discuss this. As always, like for you guys watching, if you have comments or thoughts, please leave them in the comments, and I actually do read a good bit of the comments these days. So if you leave them and you have some really good thoughts or interesting objections, they may actually have an impact on the future content that we produce here. So be sure to leave your thoughts and engage with the material. So with that, Andrew and Perry, thanks for coming on. What did y'all think? Did you enjoy the show? Or
it was good.
Feel free to, yeah.
It was good to dig in, good to talk with you, Cameron, and I hope that this is a benefit to people.
Perry's just not.
Oh, am I supposed to say something? Yeah, it was cool.
All right, we'll end it. All right, thanks you guys.
I'll just add, like, and sometimes these things get into like who got the upper hand or who was like Cameron or Stephen or whatever. And like, I hope that people just watch and they learn new things and they get more educated and they benefit. I feel like that's sometimes debates are a good avenue by which to like an interesting, fun way to learn, because it's a little more polemical. But really, the end result, I think, is learning, and then for you trying to figure out what you think is where you think the evidence points and finding what's true. So I guess that's a little bit more I'd add.
That's good. We'll end it there. Thank you guys again for coming out. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video. See you guys. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?